A very insightful study was released yesterday from Pew Research Center. It is their religious landscape study. Now, according to this study, the number of self-identified Christians has been in a steady decline since 2007, but this new report seems to show that number has stabilized in the past few years. So what does that mean? Why is it stabilized? What does the future look like? Well, we're going to begin our discussion with the lead researcher in this, Greg Smith. He's the Senior Associate Director at Pew Research and led the research on this study. Greg, welcome to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
So give our listeners and viewers kind of just an oversight of this study. This is not the first time. This is the third. It's like 393 pages, so it's a quite extensive. Give us the history and the reason for it.
Yeah, this is the third time, as you mentioned, that we've done the study. We did it the first time in 2007. We did it again in 2014, and now we've repeated it for the third time. This is a huge survey. We sampled more than 36,000 Americans from all across the United States. We've got data on all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And the purpose of the study is to paint a comprehensive religious portrait of the United States. The large sample makes it possible to drill down and look at the characteristics of even some smaller groups. We include dozens, if not 100 or more questions about people's religious beliefs and practices. And we really hope it can be a comprehensive resource of data about religion in the United States. You know, the U.S. Census Bureau does not collect information about religion, and we hope this can help fill that gap.
All right, so I have 100 questions for you after reading through this. I love data. I think it's very insightful. And so, but before I get into my questions, well, this is my question, but I want to ask you this. What was most surprising to you in this research that you found this time?
Definitely the thing that's most striking to me is the recent stabilization in religion in the United States. You know, for a long time, for many, many years, really decades, we've been tracking gradual declines in American religion, including declines in the share of people who identify as Christians. That goes back a long time. But what really struck us about this new survey, along with other data that we've conducted, is that if you just zero in on the last 4 or 5 years, we've really seen a period of stabilization. Those declines have stalled. The share of U.S. adults who are Christians after declining for many, many years has stabilized. Meanwhile, the share of Americans who say they have no religion, the share who describe themselves as atheist or agnostic or just nothing in particular with respect to religion, after growing for many years, that group has plateaued as a share of the American population. So that's what was most striking to us.
So what do you believe is behind this leveling off of the decline?
Well, there's a couple things we can point to. First of all, to understand the long-term trends, you have to understand that a big part of what's happened in American religion is generational replacement. You have older cohorts, older groups of people who by and large are quite religious. And as they have passed away, they have been replaced by new generations of young adults who are simply far less religious than their parents and grandparents before them. Additionally, if we look back over the long term, each age group, older people and younger people and everyone in between, has grown less religious over time. But over the short term, over the last 4 or 5 years, every age group has shown signs of stability. And furthermore, the data show that the youngest Americans, those who are, say, between the ages of 18 and 24 today, they're not really much less religious than the second youngest group of Americans. So the youngest Americans are sort of tugging down on the nation's overall religiousness, but not as much as would be the case if they were substantially less religious than the generation that immediately preceded them.
Could this suggest that there's a rediscovery of religion or a revival of sorts?
I'm not sure if we can say there's a revival of sorts. I think what we see, I would describe it more as stability rather than a revival. You know, one question this raises, as well as this recent stability, is that going to prove to be a lasting feature of the American religious landscape? And, you know, we can't tell the future. It's too hard to know. But there are a few things we do know. We know, as I mentioned, that the oldest Americans are much more religious than the youngest Americans. We also know that older people will decline as a share of the population as they pass away, and the people coming behind them are much less religious. So if this recent stability is to prove to be a lasting change, is to prove to be a lasting feature in American religion, something will have to change. Either today's youngest adults are going to have to become a lot more religious as they get older, or there are going to have to be new generations of young adults that come onto the scene who are more religious than today's young adults. One of those things is going to happen for this stability to be lasting.
Yes, I mean, when you look at the long-term trends. Greg, one thing I saw here that suggested that's a possibility is in your gender gap, the gender pattern, where there's actually a decline in the gender gap between men and women, where historically women expressing more religiosity than men. But I believe in the youngest adults, that gap is not that wide.
That's exactly right. You know, historically, by a lot of measures, we've seen that women in the United States tend to be more religious on average than men. They're more likely to attend religious services, more likely to identify with a religion, more likely to pray regularly. But that gender gap, while it's still there, women are still more religious than men on average. It definitely shows signs of narrowing over time, and it's much smaller among the youngest adults than among the oldest adults. For example, among young people in the United States, women are only a tad more likely than men to say they pray regularly, whereas among the oldest people in the United States, women are like 20 points more likely than men to say they pray every day. So the gender gap in American religion does shows signs of shrinking.
Now, I know this is not part of your study here, but in our research on family formation and religious expression, that when the father or the male takes the lead, it has a greater influence on the entire family. So I think if you see that gap narrowing, suggesting that men are stepping into that role, it could have that type of change influence that you were discussing that would be needed to keep this plateau and stopping the further decline.
Well, the data show very clearly that someone's religious upbringing is very closely connected to what you might think of as religious outcomes. And what I mean by that is that the data show people who are raised in highly religious homes are way more likely than people who aren't to grow up to be religious themselves as adults. Now, it's no guarantee that someone raised in a religious home will grow up to continue to be religious themselves, but it's certainly more likely as compared with folks who aren't raised in religious homes.
Well, speaking of that, Greg, one final question for you. Speaking of homes, let's talk about fertility rates and religious affiliation, because that's covered in this report, and I thought that was quite interesting.
It is. You know, a lot of times when we think about American religion, we think about beliefs and practices and how those things might change among individuals over time. But it's also important to point out that demographics is a big factor in American religion. What's the age structure of a given religious group? How many children do people from different religious backgrounds have? What about immigration? What effect does that have on the religious makeup of a place? All these things are super important when we think about trends in American religion and the future of American religion.
Yeah, is it in looking at the fertility rate, the highest fertility rate among those identified in this study are evangelicals with 2.3, just above the sustainability level, where you see a lot of the others declining. So demographics do matter when you talk about the future, and if the home and what people experience in the home is a predictor of what they do when they grow up, if you've got bigger homes where people are being exposed to Christianity and to the Bible, that does give us some hope for the future.
It's certainly true, yes. The people's religious upbringing does have an impact on their religiousness as adults. I would say it's important to keep in mind as well, though, that the age distribution of a population matters just as much as the fertility rates. So fertility rates for Christians might be somewhat higher, but Christians are also older on average than people who say they have no religion. And so those are the folks who are more likely today to be in their childbearing years. So it's a very complicated picture. All these things come into play.
But it's well done, and good job, Greg. I appreciate having this information. It's very insightful, and I appreciate you joining us today to kind of break it down.
That's very kind of you. It's great to be with you.
All right, have a great day.